Python removal is nothing new here in the Sunshine State, from the work of Florida Fish and Wildlife to the annual Python Challenge. But now the state has teamed up with another partner, helping achieve record-setting removal numbers in the Everglades.
Somewhere over Alligator Alley, a small aircraft banks low across a stretch of sawgrass that looks, from 1,000 feet up, like it hasn't changed in 10,000 years. A crate sits open on the floor of the cabin. Inside it, hundreds of dead mice, each one packed with a dose of medicine, each one clipped to a strip of biodegradable cardboard that will hang it in the canopy instead of letting it drop to the ground. A technician leans toward the open door and starts feeding them out, one after another, into the wind. By the time the run is finished, a few hundred rodents will be hanging in trees across a few acres of wetland, waiting to be found by something that was never supposed to be there in the first place. This is not a rogue operation, and it is not science fiction. It is one of the most seriously discussed strategies for solving a problem that has, by every conventional measure, already been lost: the Burmese python invasion of South Florida. Florida has been fighting this snake for almost 2 decades, and the numbers tell a story of a battle that keeps being won in individual skirmishes and lost in the aggregate. State-sponsored removal programs, professional contractors, and the now famous Python Challenge, an annual hunt that draws competitors from across the country, have combined to pull tens of thousands of pythons out of the Everglades since organized removal efforts began in earnest. It sounds like progress until you look at the effort required to produce it. Wildlife agencies have reported that, on average, it takes many hours of combined manpower to locate and capture a single snake. Hunters walk levees at night with headlamps. Trackers follow radio-tagged females to breeding aggregations. And still the population outpaces every method thrown at it. Nobody actually knows how many Burmese pythons live in South Florida today. Estimates range from the tens of thousands into numbers wildlife officials are reluctant to say out loud in public settings, because a hard number would only underline how far removal has fallen behind reproduction. A single female can produce a clutch of dozens of eggs in a season, and in a landscape of dense sawgrass, warm standing water, and no winter die-off, survival odds for those hatchlings are far higher than almost anywhere else on the continent outside the snake's native range in Southeast Asia. The ecological toll has been documented in ways that are hard to argue with. Surveys of mammal populations in python-heavy parts of the Everglades have found rabbit, opossum, and raccoon numbers down by the vast majority of their historic levels. Necropsies have turned up whole deer and bobcats inside python stomachs. The snake is, functionally, an apex predator with almost no natural check on its numbers, dropped into an ecosystem that had no evolutionary answer for something like it. The core problem with every conventional response is the same. You cannot hunt what you cannot find. You cannot trap an animal that has no interest in bait. And you cannot poison a snake without poisoning the water it lives in, along with everything that drinks from it. That dead end is what pushed researchers to stop asking how to hunt pythons more efficiently and start asking a much stranger question. What if you could make the food supply itself the weapon? To understand where that question leads, it helps to look 8,000 miles away, to a small island in the western Pacific that lived through a version of this nightmare decades earlier. In the years following the Second World War, the brown tree snake arrived on Guam, almost certainly as an unnoticed stowaway in military cargo. It was not an obviously dangerous animal, mildly venomous, not aggressive to people, easy to overlook. But Guam's native birds had evolved in total isolation from ground-based predators. They nested low, they had no instinct to flee a moving shape on a branch, and they had absolutely no defense against a nocturnal, climbing snake that could reach nearly any nest on the island. Within a few decades, the damage was almost total. Field researchers documented snake densities in parts of Guam's forest reaching into the thousands per square mile. A dozen native bird species stopped breeding entirely, and several more collapsed by the overwhelming majority of their populations. Forests that had once been full of birdsong went quiet within a single human lifetime, and songs, ceremonies, and cultural traditions tied to those birds lost their living reference points. The snakes didn't stop with wildlife, either. Power outages from snakes bridging electrical transformers became a routine, expensive nuisance across the island. Out of that disaster came an unlikely discovery: acetaminophen, the same over-the-counter painkiller found in nearly every household medicine cabinet, turned out to be lethal to brown tree snakes at very small doses. Their livers simply cannot metabolize the compound the way mammals can. It builds up, shuts down liver function, and kills. Researchers realized they didn't need to trap or hunt the snakes at all. They needed only to get a lethal dose into something the snakes would eat voluntarily. Dead mice, laced with the drug and rigged to snag in tree branches on their way down, became the delivery method. Field trials on Guam using this exact approach reported snake population drops of well over half in treated zones, and the method has since been scaled up into much larger operational campaigns. The obvious question is why anyone would think a technique built for a small, tree-climbing snake could do anything to an animal that can grow past 15 feet and swallow a deer whole. The answer, researchers say, isn't about the adults at all. It's about biology that most casual observers of this story never think to ask about. A newly hatched Burmese python bears almost no resemblance, behaviorally, to the massive, semi-aquatic ambush predator it will eventually become. For roughly the first year or two of life, juvenile pythons are small, mobile, and active climbers. They move through low canopy and understory vegetation, hunting exactly the kind of prey an adult python would never bother with: small rodents. Herpetologists who have tracked young pythons using radio telemetry describe them as constant explorers, covering more ground relative to their size than adults ever will, investigating anything that might be edible. That single behavioral fact is what makes the mouse-drop concept plausible in Florida at all. The bait is scaled for exactly the animal biologists want to target, and the target animal is, for a narrow window of its life, biologically primed to go looking for precisely that kind of bait. And the math behind targeting juveniles instead of adults is straightforward population biology. A female python doesn't need to be killed as an adult to stop contributing offspring to the population. She only needs to be prevented from surviving long enough to reproduce. Remove enough hatchlings and yearlings consistently across enough seasons, and the population's replacement rate collapses even without a single adult being caught. The scale required to make a dent, though, is staggering. Where Guam's brown tree snake campaigns operated in the tens of thousands of bait units, researchers modeling a Florida-wide version of this strategy have discussed drops numbering in the millions, repeated multiple times a year, across the entire range the python now occupies in South Florida. That is the part of the plan that turns a clever fix into a genuinely fraught proposition. Guam's ecosystem, by the time large-scale bait drops began there, had already absorbed most of its worst damage. Many of the bird species most vulnerable to the brown tree snake were already gone or functionally extinct on the island. The collateral risk calculation, grim as it sounds, was being run against an ecosystem that had little left to lose. The Everglades is not in that position. It remains one of the most biologically diverse wetlands in North America, home to hundreds of bird species, dozens of reptile and mammal species, and an aquatic food web that connects nearly everything living in it. Acetaminophen is not selective. It does not know the difference between a juvenile python and any other animal willing to eat a free meal lying in the grass. Start with the mammals already devastated by python predation. Raccoons and possums, whose populations have already fallen by the overwhelming majority in heavily infested parts of the Everglades, are exactly the kind of opportunistic scavengers who would take a free, motionless meal without hesitation. A population already pushed toward collapse by one invasive predator would be absorbing a second blow from the very campaign designed to fight that predator. The danger does not stop at direct poisoning, either. An animal that eats a treated mouse and survives can still carry drug residue in its tissue. A predator that eats that animal, an owl catching a poisoned squirrel, for instance, receives a secondary dose, and the chicks it feeds in the nest have far less tolerance than an adult. These chains move through multiple trophic levels simultaneously and are nearly impossible to trace once bait has been dispersed at any real scale. Every part of a wetland food web is, in a sense, load-bearing, and pulling on one strand rarely stays contained to that strand alone. Then there is the species that risk models keep coming back to as the single most serious concern: the Florida panther. Wild population estimates for the panther sit at only around 120 animals, confined to a shrinking range in the southwestern part of the state that overlaps almost entirely with core python territory. Felines are unusually sensitive to acetaminophen because their livers lack the specific enzyme pathway that allows most mammals to break the drug down safely. Even small doses can cause red blood cell destruction and liver failure. Panthers are also opportunistic scavengers that investigate unfamiliar smells and move through exactly the low, wet vegetation zones where aerial bait would concentrate. Conservation biologists who track this population describe a species with essentially no margin left to absorb an additional, avoidable source of mortality. Losing even a handful of animals to secondary poisoning could meaningfully accelerate an extinction that is already underway. There's also an irony buried in the middle of this plan. The eastern indigo snake, the longest native snake in North America, and one of the only animals in Florida known to actively hunt and kill juvenile pythons, also eats mice. Its population has been declining for decades due to habitat loss, and expensive breeding and reintroduction programs are underway to try to rebuild its numbers. Whether the species has any natural resistance to acetaminophen has never been formally tested. Introducing a large-scale bait campaign risks poisoning the one native predator that already does, for free, exactly what the program is trying to accomplish. Australia offers a preview of how these campaigns tend to play out once they move from pilot study to full deployment. Facing its own invasive predator crisis from foxes, feral cats, and rabbits, Australian wildlife agencies turn to a compound called sodium fluoroacetate, known as 1080, which happens to be far less toxic to native Australian species than to introduced mammals, because many native plants there naturally produce a related compound and local wildlife evolved a tolerance for it. Large-scale 1080 campaigns produced real, measurable recoveries in koala and wallaby populations in parts of the country. But the program also produced casualties nobody had planned for. Birds of prey died from eating poison carcasses. Some native parrots and other birds turned out to be more sensitive to the compound than expected. Reptiles that fed on poisoned remains were affected as well. And within a couple of decades, some rabbit populations began showing measurable tolerance to the poison, meaning the very thing the program was built to eliminate had started adapting around it. The lesson from that experience isn't that large-scale poisoning campaigns are automatically wrong. It's that no intervention deployed across a complex living ecosystem produces only its intended effect. Collateral impact isn't an unlucky exception to these programs. It is a structural feature of them. And the harder question is always whether the benefit to the target population is worth the cost to everything living around it. Florida has already shown, in a much smaller test case, how it responds to this kind of intervention. When a biotech company received approval to release genetically modified mosquitoes in the Florida Keys, designed to crash local populations of a disease-carrying species without chemical spraying, the public reaction was intense. Protests, lawsuits, and community meetings that turned openly hostile followed, even though the modified insect in question was a species almost nobody has any affection for. A proposal to drop millions of acetaminophen-laced mice from aircraft into one of the most iconic wetlands in the country, mice that raccoons, panthers, eagles, house cats, and endangered indigo snakes could all conceivably encounter, is a considerably larger ask of public trust. Any rollout at meaningful scale would almost certainly need to clear not just ecological review, but a genuinely difficult public conversation. One where scientific nuance and viral outrage would likely arrive in the same news cycle. For now, the fight continues through more conventional, if insufficient, channels. Contractors and licensed hunters keep removing thousands of pythons a year. Detection dogs trained to locate pythons by scent have shown real promise in controlled trials, though scaling that approach requires training infrastructure and funding that doesn't yet exist at the necessary level. Tracking radio tag females to locate breeding aggregations has become one of the more effective tools currently available, since a single collared female can lead searchers to a cluster of a dozen or more males during breeding season. Researchers are also exploring pheromone-based lures that could draw males into traps without active hunting, along with early, largely theoretical work on pathogen-based biological controls and genetic strategies loosely inspired by the mosquito program. None of these alternatives are ready to deploy at the scale the crisis demands, and none of them carry the blunt, helicopter-deployable simplicity of a mass mouse drop. That is precisely what makes the acetaminophen strategy so tempting and so unresolved at the same time. It might be the only approach with a real shot at matching the scale of the problem, and it might also be the only approach capable of causing damage broad enough to rival the crisis it's meant to solve. The pythons, in the meantime, are not waiting for a decision. Somewhere in the sawgrass tonight, a female is coiled around a fresh clutch of eggs, keeping them at exactly the right temperature, in a landscape with almost nothing left that can stop her. Florida's wildlife agencies are left holding a genuinely difficult truth. The only tool powerful enough to plausibly break this invasion at scale might also be powerful enough to wound the very ecosystem it's meant to save. And right now, nobody can say for certain which outcome would win.